Okay, hello everybody. Today we're going to be looking at westward expansion after the American Civil War. Here are the relevant key terms we're going to look at. We're on volume 2 of YOP, and just a quick content warning. There will be descriptions of graphic violence in the second half of this video, so if you have children nearby, it's best to move elsewhere or get some headphones. So let's get back into mining in the West. We know that mining, of course, is something that dates back prior to the Civil War with the discovery of gold in California in 1849. What we're going to see is that following the Civil War, that rush to the West to make money off of mining continues, and if anything, just accelerates. Part of that is because silver is discovered in Nevada in the 1870s, 1880s, thereabouts. And other miners end up finding huge discoveries of gold and silver. By 1880, miners at the Comstock Lode region in Nevada had extracted a total value of $270 million in gold and $400 million in silver. And some of those mass quantities were thanks to new innovations in mining, such as hydraulic mining, as you can see down here in the lower right. So these massive numbers, it's important to note, even though folks would read about millions of dollars worth of gold and silver discovered in the newspaper, it's important to realize that just because of the ownership structure of these industries, that it was really the corporations themselves and the owners of these mines that were making the most money, not the miners themselves. Mining towns cropped up all over the West to support these mines themselves. So we see the growth of the service industry around the mines. We also see small governments, of course. And so it was actually the towns themselves that made more money most of the time than the mines. Women also often would move to the West to seek new economic opportunities, many of them single. They would take on jobs in the service industry. And also, women secured the right to vote in Western states far earlier than women in the North and South in general. So, for example, women in Wyoming Territory gained the right to vote in 1869, and Mormon women in Utah were able to vote by 1870. But you do see in other parts of the West, women got the right to vote much later, like Nevada, where they don't get voting rights until 1914, and that's only 6 years before the ratification of the 19th Amendment. But nonetheless, the West was seen as this place of opportunity also for women, not just younger single men. We'll get back to women's suffrage in a future video. Let's look at the growth of the cattle industry. In many ways, it's something that is seen as uniquely American. It's important for us to realize that in order for the cattle industry to grow, the almost extinction of the bison also took place at the same time. So the American bison had been roaming the American West since, well, for tens of thousands of years. And in the mid-19th century, their population was about 10 million. And by the late 19th century, there were only a few hundred bison left. So the American Railroad helps facilitate the growth of this new cattle industry and also the meatpacking industries in American cities, particularly in the Midwest. The cattle driving industry essentially was this route from these ranches up to these railroad networks. And just to give you a sense of the sort of money that could be made, let's say a cattle was purchased for about $4 in Texas. It would be driven up through these cattle trails. This could take up to 3 months. And then by the time they would reach some sort of rail network city like Dodge City, Kansas, that same group of cattle could be sold for more like $40. And then from there, they would be shipped by train to meat packing plants in cities like Chicago, where the price would be even higher. And then it would reach consumers. So again, railroads made these possible. And these cattle drives, just like those mining towns, they lead to the growth of new towns in the West. The cattle ranching industry, it's very much romanticized in American folklore and film and music even. It does experience some difficulties by the 1880s. And part of that is because so many folks, again, move out to try to seek these opportunities, and that leads to overgrazing of land. Eventually, drought strikes the region, and there's little grassland left for grazing cattle. And the open range also starts to close off. And part of that is because barbed wire fencing was invented in the late 19th century. And so when farmers who could afford that would close off their farms, others could not freely graze their cattle anymore. Sort of reminds me of the enclosure movement in Europe prior to the colonial era in the United States. or rather, the American colonies. In any event, by 1900 or so, those glory days of the cowboy culture were over, but we'll continue to talk about these sort of myths and realities of the American West moving forward. Let's look at Mormons. So the Mormons do date back prior to the Civil War. The Mormon Church, aka the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also abbreviated as LDS, was founded in 1830 by Joseph Smith, way up in upstate New York, Fayette, New York. And Smith ran into a lot of opposition, both in his original community in New York and subsequent communities in Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois. And a lot of this was because of this uneasiness with their practice of polygamy, multiple marriages. And so eventually, after Joseph Smith dies, the new leader of the church, Brigham Young, decides to lead his followers into Utah in the mid-1840s. And they experience a lot of the hardships that those initial pioneers did, but eventually, thanks to cooperative methods of irrigation, they start to experience more success and more settlers follow. But again, they face challenges. In particular, in 1848, these cricket and grasshopper infestations end up devastating their crop. And by the end of 1848, about 5,000 Mormon settlers had arrived in and around Utah and Idaho. And these Mormon settlements did displace many indigenous groups that already lived there. And there's continuity there. In the mid-20th century, around the 1950s, 1960s, you see these so-called Indian placement programs, and these are not unique to Mormons, I should say. These are very much religious in nature. They were policies that where white families would adopt indigenous children to attempt to assimilate them into white culture. And this is quite a pattern as we move forward in terms of American indigenous relations, that you start to see that instead of using violence, there is more of this focus on just kind of turning indigenous people white, at least culturally. I know that sounds strange. Hopefully it will make more sense when we continue to talk about this moving forward. The Mormon community experiences lots of prosperity, and it's very much because of this Commonwealth type of society. Brigham Young is made governor of the Utah Territory by 1850, but then in the late 1850s, the U.S. government becomes more and more uncomfortable with this huge presence of Mormons in this part of the country. And again, a lot of this is because of this moral confliction with polygamy. In 1857, the federal army ends up marching against the Mormons. This conflict is settled without a ton of bloodshed, but nonetheless, in the 1860s and 1880s, Congress passes two different anti-polygamy laws, and polygamy is abolished in the United States. And the unique marital customs of the Mormons end up continuing to delay Utah's application for statehood, because this was not something the U.S. government wanted Utah to put in its state constitution. Eventually, though, Utah does become a state by 1896. And as of 2020, the Church of Latter-day Saints has over 13 million members worldwide. And I believe it's the fourth biggest religion in the United States. So let's get into government efforts to try to populate the West. So the majority of migrants to the West were farmers, and many of them took advantage of what was called the Homestead Act that was passed in 1862. And what that did was it allowed up to 160 acres of land to anyone who was able to improve it within 5 years. I put improvement in quotes because the language of this bill was quite ambiguous, and often railroad corporations actually took advantage of these homestead opportunities, and they ended up oftentimes getting the best of the land that was available to the homesteaders. And smaller families oftentimes were faced with land that was drier and less fertile. But nonetheless, hundreds of thousands of migrants moved into the Great Plains region to try to gain free land. This was not super inclusive. The vast majority of homesteaders were white, but one notable exception is the Exoduster movement, where African American families, most of whom were trying to flee the Jim Crow South, ended up moving to Kansas. But again, they were excluded from many other homesteads. Even if they initially settled the land, oftentimes when the 5 years were up, if they tried to apply for the deed, there would be some sort of roadblock standing in the way. Also, women tended to be excluded from homesteading, at least independently, because laws during this period did not allow women to independently own property. They were essentially bound to their husbands, or if they weren't married, their fathers. So really, it was only widowed women, if anything, that could take advantage of this, because divorce was very uncommon at this point as well. Let's see, homesteading was also really attractive to immigrants, particularly from European countries that still had this practice called primogeniture, which basically means that only the firstborn son inherited property. And so younger sons would end up moving to the United States and trying to homestead. And after those 5 years, if they were lucky, they would be able to keep that land and then be able to pass it on from generation to generation. But again, this farming was difficult. The farmers that succeeded, I should add that only about two-thirds of homesteaders actually failed in improving that land within 5 years, and therefore were unable to secure the deed to that property. And again, just like the Mormons, they experienced things like extreme heat and cold, plagues of grasshoppers, which is so gross. Look at that. Ugh, shudder just looking at it. Water was scarce. Oftentimes they had to dig much deeper to be able to reach water while they were building wells. Machinery was very expensive. And western Kansas ends up losing about half of its population between 1888 and 1892, and that's because of those failed homesteads. The families that made it, they often were successful because of innovative agricultural techniques like dry farming, deeper plowing, using hardier strains of wheat that would survive those extreme temperatures, using irrigation methods, including making dams, and also even reshaping the path of rivers and altering the physical environment of the West to provide water for agriculture. But again, even though the minority of homesteaders were the ones who experienced success, they still transformed American agriculture to the point where by the eve of World War I, the United States is acting as the breadbasket for the entire world, or at least the entire Western world, when Europe is disrupted by World War I with the German invasion of lots of farmland. So let's move forward. This is the part that has the content warning. Let's get into how all of this westward expansion is impacting Indigenous people. So let's start with the Dakota Wars. And these take place in the Dakota Territory in the north, just west of present-day Minnesota. So, or within present-day Minnesota as well. So Anglo-American white expansion in Minnesota is causing lots of pressure and strain on the Sioux Nation, and they're faced with starvation, and so small bands of Sioux warriors start to lead raids into these villages in Minnesota, and they kill dozens of men, women, and children. And so the response was essentially a war between Minnesotans and the Sioux Nation. By the end of this first Dakota War, about 300 Sioux were convicted of various war crimes such as murder, rape, and just other war-related crimes. All of them were sentenced to hang. However, just before their execution in 1862, President Lincoln did commute most of those sentences. 38 of those Sioux did, however, still hang. And the national response to this was that the U.S. government didn't do enough. The general white American public wanted more of those Sioux to be executed or to be driven off of their land. And so the U.S. military responds by chasing down this large group of Dakota Sioux that were trying to retreat away, and approximately 300 men, women, and children were slaughtered by this U.S. military, and the ones that remained were taken prisoner. And folks who tried to hide were typically smoked out by the American troops who would set fire to their villages. So fast forward to the 1870s. After that 1862 massacre, most of the surviving Sioux had signed some sort of peace agreement with the U.S. government, and the Great Sioux Reservation was established by a treaty called the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. However, just a few years later, gold was discovered within this region, and again, this leads to a huge influx of white settlers, and the U.S. government is having trouble stopping these folks from coming into this nation, despite the fact that they were violating that treaty. So eventually, the government pressures the Sioux Nation to sign a new treaty, and that transferred the Black Hills region, which was where all the gold was, back to the U.S. government. And again, the US government sends troops into the Sioux region in 1876, but this time in what was called the Battle of Little Bighorn, aka Custer's Last Stand, because the US military was commanded by General Custer. The Sioux defeated them, and Custer was killed along with over 350 American troops. So again, the American reaction in general was shock and outrage, and so future American military expeditions ended up causing Sioux attrition. So that victory for the Sioux in the Battle of Little Bighorn was again an exception. And by 1881, these American battles of attrition lead to the Sioux leader at the time, Sitting Bull, up here on the upper right, to surrender with his remaining supporters. So by 1881, the Sioux Nation essentially had just put down their arms and resigned to the fact that they were going to be confined to reservations, at least at this point. This is probably one of the hardest incidents to talk about, the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado. In 1851, there was a treaty, also called the Treaty of Fort Laramie, that allowed white Americans, I should say, to pass through this indigenous territory on their way to California and Oregon. And the gold rush, which had already started at that point, only strained the relationships between the indigenous people of that region, which included the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Comanche nations. And by 1864, again, the U.S. sent the military into a Cheyenne camp in Sand Creek, Colorado, and they slaughtered approximately 200 Cheyenne men, women, and children. The territorial governor of Colorado decided to terminate all the pre-existing treaties with these tribes. White civilians end up staging raids on the Cheyenne Indians. And probably the most gruesome example of this, the Cheyenne leader at the time, Black Kettle, ended up holding up peace banners while white drunken raiders slaughtered men, women, and children. They mutilated their corpses and even scalped Cheyenne people, and then would take their scalps back to Denver as trophies. Most of these things never reached my history textbook. It's hard to think about, but this is something that we need to pause and just realize did happen in order to pave the way for white settlement into these regions. This massacre did receive national attention, and the general American public at this point, they called for a more peaceful approach towards relations with indigenous nations. They wanted this violence to come to an end. So what we see here is an increasing shift towards non-government approaches and religious approaches to try to assimilate indigenous people, most of them children, into white societies. So when we move forward, we're going to be looking at the boarding school efforts, which again is a really traumatic chapter in Indigenous American history. So more on that later. Let's talk just about a few other indigenous nations outside of the Great Plains region. So, we can look again very quickly at the Mormons and those relations. So when we see the settling between the U.S. government and the Mormons by the turn of the 20th century, they increasingly turn to the U.S. government to help the resisting Surrounding indigenous people, who sometimes were hostile because they experienced increased encroachment on their land. And this time the U.S. did increasingly help the Mormons, and this again led to pushing indigenous people off of that land and allowed Mormons to expand their population. And in the in the Navajo region in present-day New Mexico and Arizona, we see that again examples of the U.S. increasingly using both treaties and military force to try to relocate indigenous people. And so the Navajo Nation was forced to move to a very dry and essentially barren region of New Mexico called the Bosque Redondo Valley. And this event was called the Long Walk. So one could compare it to the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. These marches led to the reservation and the conditions upon arrival in this reservation, led to the deaths of thousands of Navajo people. William Tecumseh Sherman, you might remember him as a veteran from the Union Army who led Sherman's March to the Sea in Georgia, visited the Navajo Nation after the Civil War, and he wrote about the untenable and essentially unsurvivable conditions in this region. And this led to a treaty called the Treaty of Bosque Redondo, and it was an unprecedented treaty at the time because it allowed the Navajo to return to their homeland along the Arizona and New Mexico border. And this treaty, despite the fact that it was unprecedented, did exclude most of the best farmland from the Navajo people. And then up in the Pacific Northwest, we see the Nez Perce. They were led by Chief Joseph. They attempt to flee to Canada, but the American military ends up chasing them, and they were so grossly outnumbered, eventually they surrendered and were forced to return. Just quickly touching upon California very broadly, there were many treaties signed with indigenous nations in California, but most of them were never ratified by the Senate, and therefore they were not seen as binding documents. And so the population of indigenous Californians, again with that gold rush and just agricultural booms as well, leads to the decimation of indigenous Californians. They were about 150,000 in population in 1848 in California to less than 20,000 by 1880. And many that remained were forced into what were called apprenticeship contracts. This often impacted children, and these were not paid contracts. They were essentially tantamount to slave labor. So in closing, I know that this is a very dark topic. I want us to just pause and think first. In what ways do we see westward expansion patterns after the Civil War resemble the patterns that we studied prior to the Civil War in the Manifest Destiny era? And then another thing, looking at Indigenous American relations, where have we seen similar patterns before? So compare it way back to the colonial era and also the Manifest Destiny era prior to the Civil War. And if you know anything about Indigenous American relations closer to the 20th century and the present, you could certainly consider those. More on all of this later. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.